You can let me know when you want me to start.
Yeah, ready to go.
All right. Well, great. Welcome, everyone. So glad to see you here on this evening, this little chilly evening here in Brooklyn or wherever you live. Thank you for joining us this evening. I wanted to just make sure you're in the right spot, and we are doing the Brooklyn for Peace webinar. It is called How We Ended the Cold War But Lost the Peace: Why Progressives Should Push for a Sane Alternative Foreign Policy Confirmation. My name is Michelle Smith, and I am a proud board member of Brooklyn for Peace. We like to begin, on behalf of Brooklyn for Peace, by taking a moment to acknowledge that here in Brooklyn, we are on the seas and occupied territory of the Lenape people who took care of this land for generations before they were removed by genocidal violence. Wherever we are, I invite us to pay our respects to those who came before us, their elders, past and present, and consider the legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement that enables us to be here today. Let us take a brief moment of silence to honor the many, way too many lives lost in the past year in Sudan, Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and more recently in Lebanon, as well as in the past few years to COVID-19, police violence, poverty, racism, the climate crisis, and the war in Ukraine. Please just take a moment of silence. Now, a little bit about Brooklyn for Peace. We have been working in Brooklyn since 1984, which makes and marks our 40th anniversary. December 5th, 2024 is the date we invite all of you to celebrate with us. So please go to our website for further information. Our core mission is the prevention of war and the social, racial, environmental, and economic injustice which lead to war. We are primary an educational organization. However, we see active response to injustice as a vital component of our activities, which we hope will contribute to building a strong peace and justice movement, which is so needed at this present time. If you are not already a member of Brooklyn for Peace, please go to our website, which is one word, brooklynpeace.org, and join. Basic membership is $40 a year, not a month, but a year, which equals to our 40th anniversary. But whatever you can afford, Brooklyn for Peace appreciates that. You don't need to live in Brooklyn, although that's the place to be, but you can be a member. All donations are tax deductible. A donation of any size will be greatly appreciated and will enable us to continue doing programs such as the one that you're attending tonight. We'll begin this great webinar. Before we do, I'd like to ask everyone on Zoom to please keep your microphones on mute during the program. And especially, we want questions, all questions. And if you do so, please type these questions into the chat box, and Bruce will acknowledge them and have them answered by our great speaker for this evening. This event will be recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, what we definitely want you to be a part of and to view. as well as aired on our public access TV program called War No More. If you do not want to be recorded for whatever reasons, please turn off your camera, and it's just the stop video button at the bottom of your screen. Brooklyn for Peace would like to thank the many organizations who co-sponsored this event and helped us to get the word out. And just let me just give you a quick moment to just acknowledge them. Bay Ridge Peace Action, Long Island Alliance for Peaceful Alternatives, Peace Action New York State, The Independent, and United for Peace and Justice. I will now hand the program over to Caroline Rusty Eisenberg, a co-founder and now co-vice chair for Brooklyn for Peace, who will introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I'm really delighted to welcome Katrina vanden Heuvel, speaker for this evening's webinar. As editorial director and publisher of The Nation, she is known to most of you. Between 1995 to 2019, Katrina was actually the magazine editor, as well as a frequent commentator on Democracy Now!, ABC, MSNBC, CNN. And I was looking through the list. I couldn't find Fox anywhere. I don't know. What a sad thing. She's written in multiple publications, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, was a weekly columnist for the Washington Post, which is, I think, especially valuable because it was really often the lone voice amidst the unnatural consensus. She's the author of several books, including a volume she co-authored with her late husband, historian Stephen Cohen, Voices of Glasnost, Interviews with Gorbachev's Reformers. Katrina has been recognized for her journalism and public service by numerous groups, among them the New York Civil Liberties Union, the Eleanor Roosevelt Center, the Progressive Congress, and she serves on numerous boards, including, very importantly, the Quincy Institute and the Institute of Policy Studies. So much for the formal listing of her accomplishments, which could, of course, be much longer. What I really want to recognize tonight is Katrina's heroic role in keeping alive an ongoing critique of U.S. relations with Russia and the sabotage of post-Cold War hopes. This topic of Ukraine, Russia, the U.S. Militarized involvement, this is not new, the enormously accelerated U.S. militarized involvement in the world, and also the changes in nuclear policy. These topics have not been popular for a long time, and not even among progressives, where there's been a lot of disagreements even within our own organization. And really, even before the Middle East catastrophe distracted people's attention, there really was a reluctance to get involved in all this. But Katrina has never lost focus on this. In her own writing and in her role as president of the American Committee for U.S.-Russian Accord, she has kept challenging the conventional wisdom and offering an alternative vision and a vehicle for people who have an alternative vision of what's happening in the world. And I might just mention in passing that, as many of you know, in our newsletter that we put out every week, we have, articles on various topics that are important. And a major source of those articles is actually come from Katrina's organization. Sometimes that's not recognized as a service, but it's actually incredibly important to have material that people can use and can use very readily. So really, for all of these reasons, thank you for your work, Katrina, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Rusty, thank you so much. I feel I can just go right now. It's been, all that will be said has been said. No, thank you very much. I appreciate what you said, very, very deeply appreciate the issue of Russia and the critique of Russia, and also alternatives. I've been at The Nation for much of my working life, first as an intern. The Nation turns 160 years old next July. We are the only publication now which has a peace correspondent. So I feel an affinity with Brooklyn Peace and the work you do. And I'm very grateful to be with not a room because it's a Zoominar, but with people who don't consider peace a subversive word, which I think has been part of the issue in this country. Tonight, too many wars are engulfing the world. And I think that's part of the work we have to do. It's not just single countries, but to understand the militarization of our thinking, our approach, and the dangers that poses. I want to talk briefly this evening about several intersecting threads which have brought us to this moment, and events which might have averted this crisis. And again, the alternatives, as Rusty spoke of, that were possible, that were on offer when the Cold War ended, though I think it has not fully ended. I think we live with the remnants, the vestigial elements of Cold War in our thinking, in our activities, in our approaches to issues like the military. I do think you mentioned the Quincy Institute. It's 5 years old this year, and I think it's offered. And if you don't know it, it's important to check out because it's very much inside Washington, though it's moving to engage people around the country and the world. But what it does is it carves out a third way, not a bad third way, but a third way between the kind of neocon interventionism, which we've seen so self-destructive, and the neoliberal kind of intervention. And it offers, again, alternatives to the sort of suffocating consensus that is beginning to open a tiny bit, but which dominates DC and our politics. I wanted to speak for a word about Gorbachev. He's not remembered well today, but what he taught us, I think, is regarding true security. What's so tragic is that at the end of the first Cold War, or when the Soviet Union was abolished, that's a whole discussion in 1991, there were real alternatives. Gorbachev offered a set of lessons. Militarization does not make us safer. Security starts with cooperation, mutual cooperation, and a reminder that one of the best ways to safeguard our national security is to preserve and advance democratic institutions. I think of the years I worked. I first went to Moscow in 1978. I worked, and this would be heretical today, but I worked at a glasnost, kind of ending censorship newspaper, for 3 months covering the first Congress of People's Deputies election. I saw the censor cross the street every week and negotiate new openings, which in the end, the censorship really lifted. Then it was reimposed, of course. But you could see for a glimmer of a moment what was opening, what was possible. And what was really at the heart, so much of it was redefining security, which is an ongoing piece of work we need to do, which is not just Gorbachev, it's Olof Palme, it's people in CIPRI, it's people in this country like you who've thought about security in a different way. And the security reality is not idealism, nor is it isolationism, which is used quickly to stamp out alternatives. In my view, it's a kind of realism. Rusty may get upset with that word because it's often so associated with Henry Kissinger, but there are alternatives to that. I suggest, if you might, this is not a Thursday night reading, but one day pick up, I'll post it, I'll send it. It's about 6-7 pages, but it's Gorbachev's speech to a much maligned institution, the UN, the United Nations, which is a flawed but indispensable institution, as we've been seeing. But it's a speech he gave December 7th, 1988 to the UN. It's sometimes called the anti-Fulton speech because Winston Churchill was famous for Fulton. I think it was 47. Gorbachev astonished the global community when he announced drastic cuts in the Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe, a move that eventually opened up Eastern Europe. He also, though, he laid out the lineaments of a new world order, one based, he said, on the demilitarization of international relations, changing from an economy of armament to an economy of disarmament. He wasn't naive. He emerged from the Soviet system, but he was the most radical and committed arms reductionist, abolitionist ever to lead a nuclear country. You may remember Reykjavik, where for a brief moment there was possibility, though unlikely, of abolition. But he transformed ideas into real alternatives to begin to escape the Cold War. And he understood, if we don't attempt what seems impossible, abolishing nuclear weapons, we will risk facing the unthinkable. And as important, at the end of the Cold War, the first Cold War, he and had others speak not just of NATO, not NATO expansion, but of a common European home stretching from, say, Lisbon to Vladivostok in the Far East, not a militarized zone. You've probably heard too much in these last couple of years about NATO expansion. Maybe not. Maybe you've been fortunately away from all of that talk. But what's happened in 1997, the nation did a special issue called Stop NATO Expansion. But today, or in the last couple of years, if you brought up why NATO expansion wasn't vital, why it was counterproductive, because it's essentially a lobbyist for arms sellers, you'd be called a Trumpite or a Trumpian, because Mr. Trump kept going on about how much it was costing him personally sometimes, when in fact it was a much deeper discussion about militarizing what didn't need to be militarized. When NATO was first expanded in 97, the arms dealers were the major lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And what's also clear from archives, Rusty knows these, I mean, like the National Security Archives, books, letters, correspondence, is that a fundamental promise was broken to Gorbachev. And you can say, well, who cares? But that, in a way, led then to the US triumphalism. And the triumphalism prevailing at the end of the Cold War. In reality, no one won. Who won? If you look back at the money that is continuing to be spent, and you look back years, decades, think of all that could have been done to invest, to build a public health system, for example, we were talking about, and instead poured into weapons, which now appears we may not have enough of, based on. So it was in search of a purpose at the end of the Soviet Union, NATO. It was in search of a mission. Its antithetical part, Warsaw Pact, the Soviet military institution, had folded. So it was, you know, when you hear today that there's no reason for what we're seeing in the brutal World War I trench-like war, which Russia launched illegally, don't believe that, because the NATO expansion issue has been the driving escalatory factor behind the US-Russian Cold War. And it remains so. Today, Mr. Zelensky, who's admirable, he travels the world for his country. There are issues at home that he hasn't had an election, free speech, but what he's become, in a sense, is traveling for weapons, which is tragic. I mean, he's always needing weapons. But today he said that he has a peace plan, a victory plan, but number one item is immediate accession to NATO. And that's already by European allies of this country. People have said that's not going to move. And you know, what's tragic is we're learning more and more from the records that one could have had a negotiated outcome a month or so after the Russian invasion. There was material that shows in Istanbul, Zelensky met with a Russian representative and a Georgian representative, but quickly Boris Johnson, that arbiter of integrity in the UK, flew over to Istanbul. And I think Victoria Nuland, who's back in the administration, in USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, worked hard to abort what might have been an outcome that wouldn't have left 600,000 Russian men from dying and some 150,000 Ukrainian men. Today, we learn, as the United States pushes Ukraine to lower the draft age, because it's 25, not 18, that Ukrainians and Russians are going into clubs, nightclubs, and conscripting men, just taking them. And the draft age, the limit in Ukraine is, I believe, 65, the high level. And the war weariness is enormous as they look out in a new winter, the mud. In fact, an independent polling agency in Kiev noted that some 57, 58% of Ukrainians are now open to the idea of a negotiated outcome. What basis? Not conceding that the Donetsk, Donbass area is Russia's, but it be monitored, and that Ukraine be provided with securities, not NATO, but with sufficient security guarantees that Russia will not trespass. Now, this gets to a question which there's a fervid debate about, and I understand, but the idea of a domino theory in Eastern Europe, people believe in the Baltics, which have had a tormented history with the Soviet Union, believe that their security will be impaired, to say the least, if Russia's not, I don't know, Russia's not defeated, but I mean, the idea of defeating Russia or even regime change in Russia seems so distant and so dangerous. But there are a few people in the Biden administration who see this war as a way to undertake a change of not just regime, but more than that. I think that, so we can discuss that. I will say that there were many distinguished people in the 90s who opposed NATO expansion, not just, Trumpites. George Kennan, you can disagree with, look him up, but George Kennan was one of the most distinguished diplomats vis-a-vis Russia. And he was in an interview, catch this, with Tom Friedman, and spoke of how the expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. And he went on to say something which I've always believed, that at times of war, and I've seen this myself, it's very difficult to hear voices of dissent, to hear other voices, because war brings the most nationalistic, the xenophobic, the racist to the forefront. It squeezes out space for dissenting voices. I worked for some 10 years with feminists in Moscow, with other nonprofit groups, dissident journalists, semi-dissident journalists. And when war is on the horizon or conflict between countries, as we're seeing now, it becomes much more difficult to find a way forward. I wanted to talk a little bit about the nuclear, as Rusty was saying, the nuclear issue is just critical. The dismantling of a generation of arms control is what we're witnessing. It began fundamentally in 2002 when John Bolton, you may know that name, he never goes away, by the way. There are a whole set of sort of American establishment figures who never leave the building. They're there. They've decided they're going to stay. They may move around a little, but there's not much accountability. You might have been involved with the worst, deciding that we should go to war in Iraq, not a very wise decision, but you're not moving anywhere. So in 2002, John Bolton under George W. Bush was central to the rollback of the foundational arms control treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Since then, there's been a rollback of the fundamental scaffolding infrastructure of arms control to the point where there's one treaty left, which I believe is due to come up in February 2026, START 2. And if that isn't signed, the scaffolding comes down, and it's very, very difficult to put it back together. And what's also disturbing, and more attention needs to be paid to this, is that there's a modernization campaign underway, not only in the United States, but Russia, China, which is a code word for upgrading, for making more sophisticated, for putting more money in. And now we have AI, we have other forms. So it's really critical, it seems to me, that there be more attention to the nuclear issue in both the media and in the work you do. The New York Times the other day had the presence of mind it doesn't always have to retrieve history And it reported, quote, "This appears to mark the first time that an American president has allowed the limited military responses on artillery missile bases and command centers inside the borders of a nuclear armed country." That is when the United States gave permission to Ukraine to use US missiles, European missiles, to fire into Russia. It hit an early alert warning system, one of these weapons, first go round. Early alert warning systems may be desiccated or not in good form, but they're needed like crazy. And now we see, as you know, the THAAD system with 100 US troops, I believe, traveling with them to Israel. So I want to say a few last things, but just the militarization of thought, of thinking, of security. If we continue to remain the policemen of the world, something I'm sure you've all talked about, with 800 bases ringing the world, we will not rebuild our country. We will not become the, quote, I've always believed that we do well by building our best way at home toward that more perfect union, not continuing to build military equipment. Two things. We've now adopted military Keynesianism. We're making weapons, and President Biden and Kamala Harris both say this, that we're creating jobs at home by building weapons. That's tricky. You get it? I mean, that's been the case, but it's never been, I'm probably wrong, it's been stated very clearly now that this is part of our economic system. And I think we need to go back, and this is an ask. There's conversion. I'm sure some of you remember Seymour Melman. That was moving in important ways, and it syncs with the kind of Green Deal where more productive jobs, enterprises can be had if you take some of that military money. But until you create jobs for people, there's a reason there's a military base in every district or in every state. In fact, Northrop Grumman and some of those companies are building the infrastructure in some communities. So there has to be a fundamental delinking. The Reconstruction issue, we've never been great at Reconstruction. Look at Vietnam. I mean, there's going to be a kind of, I hate to think of it this way, but a looting of Iraq. The companies are, the Reconstruction czar until last week was Penny Pritzker. Not a bad person, but her idea of reconstruction of a country is to bring in all the big corporations, BlackRock, Blackstone, private equity. So I think of the people, like people in outside Siberia or in the east of Ukraine who've waged and lived through this horror. What are they going to get now? Freedom? Or are they going to get shock therapy of a kind that, Jeffrey Sachs has redeemed himself from to some extent, because in the 90s in Russia, shock therapy led to greater depression than we faced in this country. I'm going to stop and say, I remember, as Rusty does, there were 1 million people in Central Park in June 1982 to fight for the freeze, which was a referendum on local ballots. Randy Forsberg, Randy Keeler, I don't know if you remember those names. There's a little bit of a campaign to begin that again, something simple. There are people around the country in certain city councils who have done resolutions. There's globally more around the ICANN issue and divestment from military companies. There's a cohort in the Congress, the Progressive Caucus, which includes Barbara Lee, people like that, who are worth following and supporting inside the system, and movements. The movement, climate change, and the nuclear issue might well be fused in certain areas because nuclear winter is a fundamental climate catastrophe. The answer to war is not more war. I'm not a pacifist, but there are people who say, well, what's the alternative in Ukraine? I mean, I think unless you can resolve with security, fundamental security for Ukraine, you're going to see more dying, more pain, more illness, and a kind of escalatory dominance in Ukraine that I have to say Obama recognized. He knew that for Russia, in its area, it meant a lot more to Russia, the fate of Ukraine. But I want to I want to just end, and I want to just read a quote, because he was part of, or he was our civil rights correspondent from 1961 to 67. And let me find it. So Martin Luther King Jr., a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And I believe that. I believe that. And I think it also means that there's a fear of speaking out and a fear of alternatives that is at the bridge of war politics. But I will stop, and I'd much rather take your questions. And I thank you for inviting me.
Okay, I hope we can give a round of silent applause to our speaker and thank Katrina very much for an enlightening talk. I know some
Thank
folks.
you.
I know some folks have their hands raised. They may have come in a little late. If you have a question or comment, please put it in the chat, and I'll try to pick it up and we'll address it to our speaker. So if that's why your hand is up, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat. There are already a couple of people who have put in questions, and we will take time to ask them. The first question that was asked was when you mentioned a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. What do you see as the main basis for such a settlement? What more or less would it look like?
So I would suggest to people they go back and look at the 5 or 6 negotiation outlines that have been in place since 2022. As I said earlier, just a month after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in Istanbul, there was a template. It often had to do with land, the issue of seizure of land, who that would belong to, sovereignty, but it also extended to language, it extended to religion, it extended to education, it extended to making sure that in the absence of having nuclear weapons, which were very obsolete, by the way, the Hungarian Budapest memo in '94, which is often cited, where I mentioned Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine disposed through US involvement of their weapons, nuclear weapons. They were, the cost of maintaining those weapons, the cost of refurbishing them was something Ukraine couldn't have done. But the main thing is that there have been 5 different efforts, at least, often overseen by Europe, not the United States, that could lead the way. And I think the war weariness, this serious war weariness on both sides, could sustain at this stage a negotiated outcome, which was not possible a year ago.
Okay, the next question, excuse me, asks about the nation itself, and it goes something like this. How much pushback, I guess, if any, do you face from your colleagues at the nation and elsewhere when you try to present evidence about US provocations in Ukraine? The nation seems slow to present evidence that, say, Jeffrey Sachs and Dennis Kucinich present.
Oh, no, I mean, listen, first of all, I've been going through files. My late husband was writing about Ukraine and interference and Russia, US-Russian, US-Ukrainian relations. And by the way, he had been Sovieticus. He'd been a correspondent and columnist for Victor Navatsky before my time. He was at The Nation. And he was so prescient. His last book, of course, was called War with Russia, ? And he never had a chance to take that off. And in fact, one of the issues is it's not just war with Russia, it's war with the West. I think The Nation has been, for a liberal left progressive magazine, has, unlike any other of that caliber, been out there as much, to the point where there was a rebellion inside The Nation because there was a group of people who thought that it was all pro-Trump raising these issues about the need for better relations with Russia. And one of my colleagues leaked a letter to the Washington Post. We had a real fracas, and I had to resolve that there would be differences of views. I think the Steele dossier, I think Russiagate, as it's become known, was a tragedy because it led people to ignore our own pathologies and focus on abroad. It also led to name calling and smearing of people a la McCarthyism. When your spouse, who's an informed professor at Princeton and has been visiting Russia and speaking to scholars for 50 years, is called a Putin puppet, you know you're not doing very well in terms of discourse. So I think Russiagate is one of the great tragedies. And we seem to know more and more that when Hillary Clinton lost, the shock of losing to Trump was such. And I agree, we were shocked, so many of us. But to actually resort to calling it Russian intervention, all countries intervene in other countries' business. I mean, at levels. I'm not apologizing for it, but I'm just saying I don't think it's been a very healthy time for this country. And Russia became Trump, became Putin, Putin became Trump. Putin, by the way, the Nation, when Putin came to power in 2000, wrote that he had authoritarian tendencies. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times thought he'd be a good Democrat like Yeltsin. And his first act in power, Putin's, was to give immunity to the Yeltsin family. And the oligarchs thought they could play footsie with him. He then created his own set of oligarchs, but it's a much more complicated history than is understood or discussed in this country primarily.
Hey, I was so anxious to ask some of the very good questions people have. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Bruce Heuvel. I'm a co-vice chair of Brooklyn for Peace. An interesting question. Somebody seems to have done a survey of the audience and discovered that we're an older crowd. And wanted to know what can be done to get younger people more interested in peace issues like this.
First of all, don't denigrate older people. I don't know if that's the one root of it. I don't know what's happened, by the way, to Bill McKibben's group, which he started, which was like old codgers or codgers. I mean, the Nation's demographic online is 24 to 35. The print is my age, and I just joined Medicare. But I think older people have time. Older people have passions. But it is the case that the nuclear issue is not engaging people who, for example, were in the park in 1982. Some of it, I think, is because when the Soviet Union ended, people thought we were safer, when in fact not. There are other nuclear powers, including Israel. But it's been quieted down. And I also think for younger people, an active shooter in their school is more frontally threatening. Or I was going to say, there's Reverend Barber, Poor People's, he's relaunched the Poor People's Campaign. And I'm blanking on, Pastor Mike, who's on the board of Quincy, who's in Oakland. I mean, the pathologies that run through our school system, through communities, the poverty, the policing, the school to, the police pipeline in schools. These are issues that I think can be connected to the militarization of our lives. But it is the case that people have gone kind of quiet, and climate crisis became more something people attuned to. That's why I think there's a fusion that could happen that would be valuable, not to silo the climate from the nuclear.
Somebody has asked related to that question and suggested, how about framing the issue as a kitchen table issue? A Patriot missile could play for a school.
Oh, I mean, this has been done. This is why.
Oh, yeah, we've done it too.
No, I know. And the question is, how can we move it? Everyone on this call has, heard Bill Hartung, who's at Quincy now, or others speak of what could be purchased, like a carrier, which, by the way, many of these things can't be used because of deterrence issues. But it doesn't, you have to move it. And you also have to take on those who's, as I said earlier, who believe their jobs are related to the military industrial complex, or who don't want to change that complex, which is so deep. But I do think we should continue to kind of what this costs, what that costs, but maybe with new forms that can be more interactive, maybe. Because I do think outside, I say agitation in the best sense of the word, like creative dissenters, is needed to move some of these issues.
Wait on. I have to move in the chat. The questions are coming too fast, which is great. The next question is, what is the extent of European opposition to the escalatory role of NATO and the Russia-Ukraine war? What has been the role of the European Parliament and the peace movement in Europe?
So very interesting. At the moment, it's evolved. There have been more peace demonstrations in Germany, for example, than in this country around Ukraine. You do have the rise of the right, as we've seen in France, Germany. Interesting, I mean, not the far right, but like Sarah Wagnertin in Germany is an upstart party, which did well in the regional elections last month. And they're opposed to the war. But what's also leading to opposition in Germany is the deindustrialization of Germany, because its contacts with Russia were, you can argue they were not positive, but they were there. And I think NATO is on a different path. The EU is on a different path, seeing the danger of NATO expansion and military development doing the opposite of what NATO was supposed to do, which was keep Germany. It was supposed to keep stability, but it's not, because the right wing, which we're seeing emerge, is somewhat related to what's happening with the war in Ukraine. Most difficult is the Baltics. Do you remember during the war in Iraq? It's probably very kind of abstruse. Or there was old Europe and new Europe. Old Europe was Italy, France, Germany, UK, sort of. The EU represents much of that, but the Baltics and the Eastern European countries are very much, quote, like new. And so there's a battle between those forces too. It's complicated and it's not clear. And I think it is moving to a point where Europe is more eager to resolve than.
Okay. The next question has a bit of a prelim. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994 is the governing international law between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus agreed to send the former Soviet nuclear weapons they inherited to Russia in exchange for Russia agreeing to refrain from the use or threat of force. NATO expansion was bad policy at the time. This person called it bear baiting, but in no way does it justify or excuse Putin's aggressive war on Ukraine.
No, I agree with that in the sense that I'm saying you have to understand how history informs this. I'm not saying it justifies it, but I also think the Budapest Memorandum, and I went back today to look at some explainers. It comes up on your screen quickly, but as I was trying to say earlier, Ukraine's weapons, nuclear weapons, were very old. They didn't have the operational system. It's kind of like a part of an empire strategy where the outlying republics, provinces had weapons, but they couldn't really be used. They were obsolete, old, et cetera. And, there was a kind of sense of euphoria. That was still, by the way, when the Cold War might have ended, where you had the United States. I mean, the defense secretary was over there with a shovel, like getting rid of weapons. But it was violated as in the way Ukraine has seen. On the other hand, would it be better if all these countries still had nukes?
The next one asks a question I think that's been bothering a lot of us. Most of the peace movement in the U.S. is not addressing Ukraine these days. Focus has turned, it doesn't say, but understandably, to the genocide in Gaza and widening Middle East war. How can we connect the two crises and bring the peace movement back together to work on peace in Ukraine?
I think that's such a critical point. I'm not sure it's with the Middle East. It might be with the nuclear issue, which is also afflicting the Middle East. But I think I was involved in a listserv for the international, remember the IPPNW won a Nobel Prize, Bernard Lown? the physicians for nuclear sanity, physicians
Yeah.
for. So that group is divided too. There's no question that peace groups are divided to some larger extent than we've seen on other issues, partly because this is Putin's aggression. Putin has been, and I'm not saying he shouldn't be, I'm just saying he's been demonized. Okay, we did negotiations with Stalin, who killed millions of people in the Gulag. I'm waiting for the day that there's going to be a cancel police at the Roosevelt House in New York when they take down Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill. But I'm just pointing out that the demonization of Putin and the connection made with Trump has led a lot of groups, rightly or wrongly, to say we cannot do negotiations with that country.
Yeah, I wrote a short blog post for our website pointing to the negotiations over Kosovo with a bunch of war criminals headed by Slobodan Milosevic, who was eventually prosecuted despite the agreement.
Exactly. And that should be the goal, both especially South Africa's courageous role in around Israel, but the yeah, there's been a loss, I think, of understanding of what diplomacy is. It's a very stolid kind of old-fashioned word, but what diplomacy is putting yourself in another's shoe, like cognitive empathy. Very tough, and people rightly turn away from it, but it's needed in many cases. They should, someday our international institutions, as I was talking about the UN, flawed but indispensable, will be made real by their usage. In the interim, I think it's important that they show life, as they have, certainly around Israel and the Palestine issue. But the obscenity of Israel actually attacking UN troops, peacekeepers, not new in some instances, and UNRWA, I mean, this shows a kind of a shameful ignorance of what a truly civilized, humane world looks like.
There's an interesting comment, probably doesn't require an answer. One person wanted to defend younger people because he has three, and says they're concentrated on staying employed, paying off their student debt, and paying the rent.
I think that's real. On the other hand, my daughter, who's 33, about to have a baby, spends a lot of time in Louisiana, Alabama, and Arkansas doing death penalty and wrongful conviction work. That's what really, I mean, kind of, poor Nika went to the Soviet Union and Russia 30 times. She's still interested, but finds her own way.
Yeah, we got a couple more. We got time for one or two more. One question was, could we divest from or boycott companies that invest in war, and refers to this As You Sow website?
No, listen, I was going to bring it up. I'm sorry, I can't find it, but there's Don't Bank on the Bomb in Europe is quite active. It's linked to the fossil fuel divestment movement. And I think this relates to the freeze as well, where you identify corporations that are producing key parts for nuclear weapons, and then you do a divestment, but also I think reinvestment, because take the money and use it so people can see what it can be used for. Alice Slater, I saw, was on the call, but yep. In New York and in various cities, New York City, there are resolutions on divestment. What happens is you don't see them coalesce, so they seem atomized. There are also a few good mayors. Every year I have a mayor this year from Waterloo, Iowa, write about abolition of nuclear weapons and resolutions they put through their town council. And I think it's important to find people where they are. But I haven't met a person who's intrigued by nuclear. Think of the fact, though, that in 64, I think it was 64, that ad with a nuke and the little girl and the daisies. A lot of people remember it. I mean, I wasn't old enough to, but that showed once and
yeah.
had an impact.
Yes, I've written that. Yeah, one time. I might add, just for our audience, many people are familiar with this. You mentioned Alice Slater, who was one of the more active people in
Indefatigable.
In the Move the Money movement, which Brooklyn is a sponsor and participant in, and that's to get the New York City Council to vote on a resolution to cut the defense budget. And one of the things, we haven't put it in our official asks, probably because we've been asking for so long. One of the things I would urge is if you live in New York City, contact your city council person and urge them not only to co-sponsor it, because it has enough co-sponsors. The problem has been they've refused to vote on it for several.
Absolutely. But
so
I also think the treaty, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, it shows strength and it shows a role for the global community. And I think that's worth continuing to find and focus on.
Okay, I guess we have time for one more question, and this is a big sort of, not quite sure. Some people might see it as a pie in the sky question, but it's a great idea if it worked. Do you see the possibility of the US and Russia understanding the extreme danger of nuclear war and giving up the nuclear arms race, agreeing to stop the madness of nuclear war and working for the common security of all of us?
All right. Now, listen, I'm usually the pragmatic, rational person, but I'm telling you, I worked for many years with Kai Bird, who just wrote Oppenheimer, with Martin Sherwin. And I have in my office a Nation issue from 1950, Negotiate with Russia, but I also have issues where you had the Baruch Lilienthal plan, which was to share the nukes. That didn't go too far, but that was part of the post-war. That was one of the post-war issues that emerged and was quickly because of McCarthyism, because you can argue from here to eternity that if Roosevelt had remained alive, there would have been more emphasis maybe on anti-colonialism than anti-communism. But you're not going to get a negotiated peace with Russia or sharing nuclear weapons in a really hot Cold War, as we saw after World War II, which, by the way, Cold War, and Rusty would know this, I mean, it started in the war. Anyway, yeah. But I don't think anyone should put aside something as pie in the sky. I think you can say it won't happen for many years. It may not be the thing to fix on politically, but I think you should always keep alternative visions in place and fight for them, not at the expense maybe of, immediacy, but yeah.
We do have a response from Alice Slater.
I see it.
That we got a New York City resolution to support the new ban treaty.
That's so terrific.
There is some good news there.
You mean the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons?
I assume that's what it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because there was also the divestment issue, which.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh yeah, the proliferate. Yeah, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Well, we could. This is such an important issue. We could probably go on for another couple hours, but that's not such a great idea, I'm afraid. So again, thanks so much to Katrina. A last round of applause. And before people leave, we do have a couple of words from Brooklyn for Peace. One about our upcoming events and some things you might be able to do. And next from Greg Calvin of our executive board, who has a message for our audience. So again, a round of applause for Katrina.
Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for your work, which is so critical. Thank you. And it's the young. I know it's the young, but you got to have the old. No one's here old, but you got to get them involved too.
Well, yeah.
Oh, he's young.
Yep, we do have some young board members.
I am on the younger side. I'm 30. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here on a cool Thursday night. You could be anywhere else. If you're in New York or not, you could be younger person, older person, but you're here listening to Bruce Altucher and Katrina vanden Heuvel and Michelle Smith, Rusty Eisenberg, people who are involved in, of course, publishing and intellectual work and offering other voices about foreign policy, about how the U.S. policy can be different and how the role that we can play as people who care about peace. I am a young person, so I'll say quickly, what got me involved in Brooklyn for Peace was a good, healthy fear of nuclear war. But when I went to start tabling with Brooklyn for Peace in 2022, in the summer of 2022, I learned there was a lot more that they do. They had been around, I guess, at that point for 38 years, at this point, 40. It was 40 years, I believe, earlier this year. And I think, engaging in groups, I'll just speak again for a young person that are involved in transmitting history, going out and tabling, which we do a lot, and that is part of the fundraising ask. We do need money for that. But groups that can put on forums like this, recently we had a forum with Medea Benjamin, it was actually in 2023 on the war in Ukraine. We had a forum with Dr. Ira Helfand, who's a nuclear war, not sure he might be a physician, actually. I'm not sure his exact role, but we have various forums throughout the years on these topics that seem to get great responses. We had one in June that was on militarism and then climate change. So we try to have speakers. That was Patrick Bigger. We try to have forums that touch a range of things, a range of items. But I'll keep it short if I haven't yet. I think it's important to contribute to a group like this. We have a newsletter. We, are often in the process of, although it's volunteer run, we do have paid positions. We have hired. It's maybe not the majority of what goes towards, our costs, but that is part of what you could do to contribute to us. That would kind of keep our staff. But I will also give a plug to volunteer. I think you can donate and become a member. You can donate and you don't need to become a member. I believe Charlotte, I don't put you on the spot, our chairperson, may have a screen for us with a fancy little QR code, but I will just put in the link to the website where you can donate, and our physical address as well is on that page. So, and you could also, thank you, Charlotte. You can also do double duty and attend our Thursday, December 5th fundraiser, which Michelle mentioned earlier, and contribute now. So, you can double your donation without even relying on anyone else, if you so choose. But I do think it's important. We've been here 40 years. I've been here for a small fraction of that, but I hope we can continue doing this for much longer, and your contributions would help.
Hi, I'm Nina Allen, and I'd like to make a few announcements. Yet again, I'm going to mention the upcoming event that is on Thursday, December 5th, is the Pathmakers to Peace Gala, which, as many of you know, it is an annual event that honors organizations and individuals who've played a leadership role in working to find nonviolent solutions to conflict. However, this year, the gala will celebrate the 40th anniversary of Brooklyn for Peace. We expect it to be well attended, and you can purchase tickets for this event at the Brooklyn for Peace website. The other thing I wanted to mention are actions you can take. And I have 3 in mind, but certainly there are others. The first is the UNRWA Restoration Act, which is at play in the House. UNRWA is the most important aid humanitarian distribution organization operating in Gaza and also, I believe, in Lebanon. The U.S. withdrew funding about a year ago, but there is now a measure in the House to restore that funding. If you call the House, your representative in the House, that would certainly help in pushing this measure forward. The second item that I have is Bernie Sanders' joint resolution of disapproval. And these resolutions would block the sale of offensive weapons to Israel. Yeah, I don't think it, well, if it passes, it needs to be signed by President Biden, but it certainly would go a long way in bringing peace to the Middle East once those weapons are halted, because that is what is keeping it going. And the third issue is no war with Iran. Things are out of control, and we do not want to be dragged into a war with Iran. The other thing you might mention is there is no legal authorization for that war, and that would be a call to your senators. So those are the three asks that we have on our minds at this point. I would also like to thank Katrina for her amazing presentation. I'm sure we found it helpful. And I recall one thing that she said at the beginning, which is this: security starts with cooperation. The alternative to cooperation is militarization and even war. So I think we need to bear this in mind, that security starts with cooperation. With this, unless somebody else has anything else to say, I appreciate everyone's attendance here. And unless there's more to be said, it would be time to adjourn. Any other issues that anyone wants to raise? Okay, agree to adjourn. Anybody want to second that? Okay,
Good night, everybody.
good night.
Thank you. Good night.